At my father's 70th birthday dinner, the kind of event where people wear ironed clothes and recycled smiles, the table stretched long and glossy enough to reflect every strained expression, and I sat quietly the way I had learned my whole life, small, controlled, invisible, until he raised his glass and said, with that practiced voice that always sounded like a verdict, that I had always been the disappointment, never enough, never what he deserved. And the room responded with that unsure laughter people use when they don't know whether to be amused or afraid. Forks freezing midair, relatives pretending not to stare while secretly waiting for the familiar performance. Me swallowing the humiliation like I'd been trained to since childhood. Because growing up, affection in our house wasn't something given freely. It was a currency reserved for my brother, who earned praise for existing, while I received attention only when something needed fixing, and my father had a talent for turning responsibility into guilt, repeating lines that carved themselves into my skin. If you were smarter, I wouldn't be so stressed. If you cared, I wouldn't have to raise my voice. If you loved me, you'd do better. And I didn't. T realized those weren't the expectations but instructions, shaping me into the child who apologized for things I didn't break, who carried storms I didn't create, who learned to vanish without ever leaving the room. He called it discipline, but now I know it was training, because by 16 I could anticipate moods like weather forecasts, measure silence like temperature, and survive the house without making noise. And I thought that made me strong when really it made me obedient, and the unraveling didn't. T begin with that insult at the table, but the year he slipped and fractured his hip when hospitals and paperwork flooded my life while my brother disappeared behind excuses about work and stress, leaving me to handle everything alone. And my father thanked me only when someone else was watching, turning gratitude into performance, the way he turned everything into proof that I owed him. But the real fracture wasn't in his bones. It came the afternoon. A bank officer called my phone by mistake, asking about the second mortgage taken out under my name, and at first I thought it was fraud, some stranger forging signatures, until I saw the papers and realized the signature was mine copied. Shaky, but close enough to pass, and the date sat like a fingerprint of betrayal. 1 week after I had refused to pay off my brother's debt again, and I remember standing in my kitchen with the documents trembling in my hands, not because I was scared, but because something inside me went still. Not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of recognition, like the moment a puzzle piece finally fits and the picture becomes undeniable. It wasn't the forged signature that broke me. It was the realization that this wasn't the first time he had taken something simply because he believed he had the right. That love in our house had always been permission, and my existence had always been access. And for the first time the world didn't tilt, I did, shifting into a different alignment, one where I no longer mistook survival for loyalty. And people mistake silence for surrender, but I didn't confront him, didn't scream, didn't demand explanations, because I already knew how he rewrote reality until it suited him. So instead I learned, spending months gathering documents quietly, tracing every unauthorized loan and withdrawal, every transfer to my brother labeled consultation, even though the only thing he consulted was other people's patience, and I found the attorney quietly, froze the accounts, quietly filed the fraud report, quietly building my exit like architecture, and predators always underestimate what they can't hear. So while he believed I remained trapped in the childhood role he built for me, I was constructing a life outside of it, waiting for a moment he couldn't script. And fate handed me a birthday party wrapped in gold balloons and false sentiment. So when he called me a disappointment in that room full of witnesses, he expected the usual outcome, my silence, his victory, but instead I stood slowly, deliberately, and the air tightened like the walls had shrunk around us, and this time I didn't shake, didn't look down, didn't swallow anything, and I said quietly, "Funny thing, you only call someone a disappointment when you've run out of ways to use them." And his smile faltered, the performance slipping for the first time, and my brother sat up straighter, sensing danger the way animals sense weather shifts. And I reached into my bag and placed a sealed folder beside his untouched slice of cake, watching him stare at it like it might explode. And I told him everything inside loans, signatures, reports was exact, and the room shifted as relatives leaned in, my aunt's lipstick cracking as her mouth opened, my cousin covering her face like the truth was too bright to look at directly, and my father's voice came out thin, saying I was exaggerating, and I tilted my head and repeated, "The dates are exact. You taught me to keep records," and his hands trembled, the slightest movement, but I noticed because I had been trained to notice tremors, and my brother pushed back his chair like he suddenly needed distance from the man he had defended his whole life, and for the first time my father didn't look powerful or angry. He looked small, not old, but small, like a man standing without the scaffolding of control. And I didn't wait for permission to leave because I no longer required it, stepping outside into cold air that didn't sting but cleansed, and behind me voices rose, questions, excuses, frantic rewrites, but none of them belonged to me because for the first time I wasn't holding responsibility that wasn't mine. And people talk about healing like it's sunlight, warm, soft, bright, but mine was frost clear and precise. And I didn't slam the door, I simply let it close, and as it clicked shut, I understood something with a calm so deep it felt like truth. I was never the disappointment, I was the one he underestimated, and that was the last mistake he ever made.